Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm creating some shaped holiday cards, and the fun part about these cards is I'm only using white cardstock, coloring them with the 3 new trio ink sets from Lisa Horton Crafts. I'm also using the Scallop Circles Stencil and Embossing folder set for my backgrounds. So these 3 new trio sets, I have to say this first one here is my absolute favorite. It's called the Alchemist Metallic and Pearl set. There is a natural pearl that I can't seem to stop using, as well as a platinum that has a really pretty green tone to it, and then a rose gold. Next, we have the metallic trio for 2025. It's called Winter 2025. There are 3 different colors in here. We have the blue, which is called Frozen Icicles, the green, which is called Winter Fir, and then the red, which is called Mulled Wine. Gorgeous colors with some beautiful metallic shine. And then last but certainly not least, we have a Swift Dry trio called Festive 2025. Again, 3 colors in here. The green one is called Deep Verdure. The blue one is called Starlit Noel, and the red one is called Cranberry Fizz. So these are Swift Dry. They are a hybrid ink, perfect for stamping with, but I'm also going to be doing a little bit of ink blending with them as well. They have a nice matte finish to them. These 3 die sets here are the ones that I'm going to be using for my card bases. We have the Nested Tree frame die, the Best Wishes frame die, and the Bow and Bell scallop frame. So I'm going to start with doing a little bit of stenciling for one of my backgrounds. So this piece here is Hammer Mill cardstock die cut from the Best Wishes frame die set. I'm using the Scallop Circles stencil. Now when I use stencils, I typically like to use some painter's tape on the top left and bottom right of my stencil. This is really most helpful when you're using layering stencils and wanting to put the layers together and match them really quite easily. Here it's not necessary, other than the fact that I'm using the natural pearl pad, and it's a little bit harder to see on white cardstock because it doesn't add any color. It only adds some beautiful shimmer. So that is a step that you could miss here if you want. In this case, it was done more out of habit than out of necessity. So I first did some natural pearl ink on that base, and then I'm going to do a little bit of the platinum around the outside edges, just to give it a little bit of color variation. The colors blend beautifully together, and I love the fact that this platinum has a little bit of a green tone to it. Makes it really perfect for Christmas. I think if we had it just on its own, you wouldn't necessarily see the green as much, but using it with Christmas cards, to me, it really shows that way. So by using the platinum around the outside edges, we see the pattern from that stencil just a tiny little bit more. I'm also using one of the layers from that Best Wishes frame set to add some detail to the card front. So I'm going to be doing the ink blending with rose gold for these pieces here, using my sticky mat underneath to hold all of those pieces together. And when I do my ink blending and stenciling, I go in both a clockwise and counterclockwise motion, making sure to get all of those cardstock edges, and when stenciling, making sure to get ink evenly throughout all of those edges. I don't want my ink to be heavier on one side than the other. So by going in both directions, I can make sure that I get some fairly even coverage to a point. There's when it comes to blending, especially with stencil backgrounds and stuff like that, I do make a point to do some areas that are darker and some areas that are lighter. In my opinion, it just adds a little bit more visual interest, but I do like to have control over that. And by doing it both clockwise and counterclockwise, I can make sure that I have control over where it's heavier and where it's lighter. This rose gold almost has a little bit of a coppery look to it. It's absolutely beautiful, and the metallic shine is fantastic. So I have some more die cuts here. I have the Mary from the Mary Sentiments and Stamp and Die set, and the ornament and holly pieces are from the Festive Ornaments die set. So some of the layers I'm inking with that natural pearl ink, and again, it's only going to add that pearl shimmer. When you use it on black or dark cardstock, you get a little bit of a white haze with it, but on light colored cardstock, it just adds more of a shimmer rather than any color. And then I've also used that platinum as well as that rose gold ink. By only using white cardstock here, I really let the ink colors shine and show off how gorgeous they are. You could use colored cardstocks with these, or colored cardstocks instead of using inks, but I always love just doing something a little bit different. And by using just white cardstock and using the inks to color the different pieces, it just makes an interesting and unique look, as well as a non-traditional color palette for Christmas cards. I'm gluing everything together with some Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle. It's going to work perfectly for gluing all of these little die cuts together, as well as gluing my cards together once I have all my die cut pieces glued together and ready to go. And even though it's a liquid glue, I don't need to use a ton of it. It starts to set fairly quickly and it's a nice strong hold. When I'm doing my gluing, I like to use an acrylic block just to hold everything down nice and flat. Frees up my hands for working with other pieces, but I can also see right through that acrylic block. So if something shifts while I put that block down, I can easily lift the block back up and move everything back into place. So I really like to use that to give it another use, because I don't really use the acrylic blocks for stamping anymore. I use my Misty more for doing that, but I also like to be able to not stand and wait for something to glue, or wait for something to dry, or hold something while it's drying. So once I have my pieces pretty much together, I set them to the side and we're ready to create our card base. So I have 2 pieces of plastic white cardstock here, die cut with the Best Wishes frame die set, and I'm using my score palette with a Teflon bone folder to score a line about 1/2 inch from the top. This is going to create the hinge for our card base. When you're using dies that have a nice straight edge, you can use that die and put the die side right on the opposite side of the folded edge to create card bases, but it's a little bit different when you're using shaped dies. So creating a base like this makes it really, really easy to create some fun, unique, and interesting card shapes. So once I have that base scored, I just put glue on that top 1/2 inch, then put those 2 together, and then put my die cut pieces or my card front to that card base. Now I want to use some of the stamp sentiments from that Christmas sentiment stamp and die set. So I have the stamp here. I'm using my Misty stamping tool with some hammer mill cardstock. Now with these metallic pads, you have to be a little bit careful with them because they're foam pads. They're really, they have a lot of give to them. So if you push too hard, you're going to use way too much ink. It's going to be a waste. So I am using that with my Misty stamping tool so that I can stamp multiple times. I'm just lightly tapping that ink on the raised surface. I'm trying not to press too hard, but by using a Misty and stamping multiple times, I can build that ink up and get some nice clear sentiments here. Now this does a bunch of those sub sentiments all at one time, and then there's a coordinating die set to cut those out. So once I have those stamped how I like, I let that dry for just a few moments, and then I match up my die set, taping it in place with some Best Ever craft tape so that that die doesn't move on me when I'm doing my die cutting. And once I have those sub-sentiments die cut, I'm going to have more than I need for the card that I'm creating. So I just put those in a Ziploc bag, store them right with that stamp and die set. So next time I'm working with it, if by chance I have one that's already made in a color that's going to coordinate with that project, I know exactly where to look for it. It's going to be really easy to find. Now, the one thing about using the Best Wishes frame as the base die is it does make it really challenging to make sure that your sentiment is nice and even. So I thought it was even when I was putting this together, but looking at it now doing the voiceover, it looks like my Mary is just a little bit tilted to go with the tilt from the frame angles, if you will. It totally is fine. It looks totally fine, but it's funny how you think something's nice and horizontal until you see it again afterwards. So with everything glued together, I let that glue set for just a few moments. We've got some gorgeous texture here with that metallic finish, but I wanted to add just a tiny little bit more. So I used some Stardust stickles on top of the detailed die on my ornament. Then I'm using some glossy accents on top of the berries there. So that's just going to add a little bit of sparkle texture as well as a little bit of domed glossy texture on those berries. I'll set those aside to completely dry, and you can see them once they're completely dry at the end of the video. For my next card, I'm using the nested tree frame die set for my card base. I have those card bases already die cut, but I'm using one of the inner layers to create my background piece that I'm going to use that embossing folder on. So I'm just using some hammer mill cardstock for this. I tend to use the classic white cardstock for my card bases and most of my die cuts in this video. And then I use the hammer mill cardstock for when I'm embossing and when I'm stenciling. I really like how it works easily in the embossing folder, as well as it just blends really nice. But the classic white blends nice as well. It's just a little bit thicker than the hammer mill. So it just really depends on what your preferences are. So I'm using the embossing folder, the Scallop Circles embossing folder for this particular background, and I'm embossing it in my Platinum 6 machine. Now, some of the Lisa Horton embossing folders are the right thickness to do the 3D embossing in this machine. This one's just a little bit thinner. So I have a piece of index cardstock folded in half that I just use to add a little bit of tightness, or just to tighten up my sandwich just a little bit, and it works. And I just keep this with my embossing plate so that if by chance I'm using an embossing folder and it's not quite thick enough in my sandwich, I can easily grab that piece of cardstock. By using cardstock to thicken up your sandwich, it has a little bit of give to it, and it's just a little bit more gentler on your die cutting machine. So for this next card, I'm going to be using a combination of the Swift Dry inks as well as the metallic trio set. And this is the Winter 2025 metallic trio, not that Alchemist set. I really love the look of the matte finish of the Swift Dry, but I also like the contrast with adding the metallic with it. So we get a little bit of a contrast with that matte as well as the metallic. When I'm doing my ink blending, I am not ink blending to a solid color. If I wanted a solid color, I would die cut solid cardstock. So I make sure that there's some light areas and some dark areas. So when it comes to these flowers, I made them more dark in the inside or the center of the flower of the poinsettia, and then lighter towards the outside, just to give it some color variation. At first, I didn't do quite as heavy of an inking or ink blending. Then I went in a little bit darker because I wanted to make sure to be able to see the metallic in the center. And then I used the metallic colors for the centers. For the leaves, I'm using the metallic more towards the base of the leaves and stems, and using the Swift Dry basically on the whole thing. But again, just like the flowers, I am doing areas where the ink is lighter and where the ink is darker to give it some color variation, a little bit more visual interest. Now, these foliage and flower pieces were die cut from the Christmas Foliage die set. Now, I did a bunch of leaves here. I wanted to have a lot of leaves and greenery and then a poinsettia flower in the center of it. So I want to try to make sure that my leaves aren't all exactly the same green shade. So those top ones there, I did just with that Deep Verdure Swift Dry ink. For the bottom ones, I'm using some of that Deep Verdure Swift Dry as well as some of the Starlit Noel Swift Dry. Then I'm going to go in and just add a little bit of metallic with the metallic Winter Fir as well as the metallic Frozen Icicles. But by doing some with just the green and some with green and blue, I get two different color tones here. And then when it came to the different ones on the bottom, I was heavier with the blue on one set than I was with the other set. So again, little bit of color variation. And I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised with the color that was created mixing the blue and green together. It came up with the most beautiful, dark, tealy green color. It was absolutely gorgeous. So if by chance you have ink colors that aren't the exact shade you want, mix them with other ones. And by mixing them, I mean ink blend with one color, clean off your ink mat so we don't contaminate things, and then ink blend over top once the first layer of ink is dry, and blend those two colors together, and you get some great color combinations. So once my ink blending is done, I'm ready to add or put this sentiment together. Here for this card, I'm using the Christmas Sentiments stamp and die set. So I have that Christmas die cut. You could do 3 layers with this. I'm only doing 2 because my card bases are a little bit smaller than an A2 card. I don't want to have too much area with the sentiments. I don't want to have everything filled in with the sentiments and the die cuts. I want to be able to see that card base and that background. So this background here was done with that nested tree frame die set, but I wanted to blend it in with the greenery die cuts. So I have it on my sticky mat here. I'm doing some ink blending with that Deep Verdure as well as the Starlit Noel Swift Dry ink. And then I'm going to go in and add a little bit of the Frozen Icicles and Winter Fir metallic ink. So we get a combination of the matte from the Swift Dry and the metallic from those metallic ink pads around the outside of my mat. It's just going to coordinate and blend beautifully with the greenery die cuts. So I did the green towards the top, about the top 2/3, and then I'm doing the blue on the bottom 2/3. So we get a little bit of blending of those two inks. Now, after doing that, just the blue on its own was just a little bit too much. So I did go back in with the green going over top of it just to tone it down a little bit to make sure that it was going to blend a little bit easier, a little bit better with those die cuts that I have there. Once I like how that turned out, I can go in with those metallic pads and do that same ink blending. Now, between moving my cardstock around, I did make sure to clean off my mat because this particular one is part of my card base, so it's not getting glued on top of my card base. So I want the back side of it to be nice and clean. So I lift it off here. I do turn it over so you can see that it's nice and clean, and that's due to making sure that my mat was nice and clean before or between moving them. If by chance you're gluing it down on something, it's not as important, but you do want to make sure that you have a nice, crisp, clean inside of your card if you're going to be able to see something that's ink blended on. For the second part of that card base, I did the same as my first card. I put it on my score pal and then scored it with my Teflon bone folder about 1/2 inch down from the top. Made sure that score was nice and folded, it had a nice hinge to it, and then glued those two pieces together above that 1/2 inch mark there. So the top part there was glued together. Then I can glue down my embossed background there, set that aside to dry, and we're ready to stamp some of our sub-sentiments. So I'm taking the stamp set out from that Christmas Sentiments stamp and die set, using my Misty stamping tool and stamping them onto that hammer mill cardstock. Now these ones I'm going to stamp with the Swift Dry ink. I don't have to be quite as careful with the Swift Dry ink because it is a harder pad. It is a felt pad rather than a foam pad. The metallic inks and the Alchemist inks are foam pads, so they have a lot of give to them, whereas the felt pads are a lot denser and they don't have as much give. So they're great for stamping. When I go to ink my stamps, I don't have to worry about pushing too hard because I'm not going to be able to push. Well, I think if I really tried, I could push so much that I inked the background of the stamp, but it would take a lot of pressure to do that. So they are a lot easier to do the stamping of the sub-sentiments. Once I have them stamped, they dry really quickly. I can match up the coordinating die set. I do tape that again with that Best Ever Craft tape to make sure that it doesn't move on me. And then I have a ton of sub-sentiments here ready to go that match perfectly with my die cuts because I use the same ink for stamping as I did for ink blending. So I have my sentiment and my sub-sentiment here. I'm going to glue them to the bottom of the card, and then I'm going to add my greenery pieces on top. Now I want to have my greenery behind my poinsettia, so I do glue them in different layers right on that embossed background. Now I do this often where I do a bunch of different greenery and floral pieces together, so I'm quite comfortable with it. But if you're not as comfortable with it, what I would suggest is putting an acrylic block on top of your piece, laying out your pieces, and once you have them the way that you like, you can lift that acrylic block off and move it to the side so you still have your arrangement. Then you can glue those pieces down, confident that you know how they're going to look and that you like that arrangement. The other thing is with using some liquid glue here, that liquid glue gives you wiggle room. So if by chance you don't have everything placed perfectly to start with, you can easily move and shimmy things in place. When it came time to assembling that poinsettia, I used my fingers to curl the petals so they have a little bit of natural dimension to them. So when it came time to gluing that down, I only put glue on the inside, the center part of that floral, and then glued that to my greenery. Now you could leave it with just those inks on there, but again, I want to add just a little bit of texture. So I just use that Stardust Stickles, put it in the center of that poinsettia, and then I'll set that aside to completely dry. For my third card, I'm using the Bow and Bell Scallop frame die set for the base of my card, but I'm using that tree die set or the tree dies from the nested tree frame. I just really like the unique look of that tree. It's really easy to put together, but it just has a fun and unique look to it. Once again, they're die cut out of classic white cardstock. I'm going to be using a combination of the Swift Dry as well as the metallic inks to color my tree. So I'm going to go in with the Swift Dry first, doing the green and then the blue. Then I'm going to go in and just add just a touch of that green winter fir metallic just to the bottom edge. These layer on top of each other, so there's no point in doing a lot to the top of those pieces because there's going to be something covering it anyways, and I don't want to cover up. Well, I don't want to do any ink blending over something that's going to be covered up anyways. By adding the metallic just to the bottom, I get a combination of that matte Swift Dry as well as the metallic shimmer on the bottom, and it's really beautiful. For my background, this is the background that I'm going to use both the Scallop Circle stencil as well as the embossing folder. So I have one of the pieces die cut from that Bow and Bell Scallop frame die set, one of the different layers. I'm first going to do my ink blending on that base with the Cranberry Fizz, then do a little bit of the mulled wine metallic around the outside edges. And just like I mentioned before, you can see as I'm doing my ink blending that I'm going in clockwise as well as counterclockwise motion. I'm also putting some areas where that ink is heavier, some areas where it's a little bit lighter. To me, it just adds visual interest. You could, if you prefer the look of it, make it all even all the way down. But again, I just like it where some areas are darker, some areas are lighter. I just love the look of that, and I think it looks a little bit more interesting. Then I'm going in with that mulled wine metallic ink, just doing it along the outside edges. So the pattern on the inside is going to be matte. The pattern on the outside is going to have just a little bit of that metallic shimmer to it to frame everything in. But all of our die cuts are done with the blues and greens, so they're going to show up really nicely on this background. Now I'm using this Scallop and Circle stencil and embossing folder for my background. You could use a different one if you want. It doesn't have to be this particular one. I just hadn't used this one for many things before, and I just wanted to see it on the background. It's a nice, simple pattern that doesn't detract from the die cuts on top. Then I match that stencil background with my embossing folder. I tend to do my stenciling before my embossing because I prefer doing my stenciling on flat cardstock rather than embossed cardstock. But I do encourage you to try it both ways and see which way you prefer, because what one person prefers isn't necessarily the best way for everyone. Everyone has their own preferences. With that background stenciled and embossed, I can put my tree together, and you can see it's super easy to put the tree together. For the star as well as the trunk on my tree, I ink blended that with that rose gold metallic ink pad just for a little bit of a different color. It coordinates beautifully with the mulled wine and Cranberry Fizz color, but it is a little bit of a different color tone, so it doesn't blend as much into the background. With my die cuts and my background in place, I can work on my card base. So again, I have two pieces that were die cut from that Bow and Bell Scallop frame die set. I can take one using my Score Pal and bone folder. I can score it about a ½ inch from the top, fold that score line to make sure that it folds really nicely, and then glue those two pieces together before gluing on my stenciled and embossed layer. This particular one, I left the outside edges white because we have the white snowy layer on our tree, as well as I left my sentiment white for a nice bright white against that stenciled and embossed background. If you wanted, you could ink blend them instead. I'm choosing one of the sub-sentiments that I did with my last card. It worked perfectly with the Merry Christmas here. Now I'm using the Merry from the Merry Stampin' Die set. Merry Sentiment Stampin' Die set, and I'm using the Christmas from the Christmas Sentiment Stampin' Die set. These are two different Stampin' Die sets, but they work really, really well together. So I thought it would be fun to use those bold sentiments together. For this particular one, I'm not using any of the shadows, so you could put those shadows behind there if you wanted that extra layer, or you could leave them off. So there's so many different options with these Sentiment Stampin' Die sets, and I love that there's so many different ways to use them. Once I have my sub-sentiment as well as my die cut sentiments down, I can glue down my tree. And then there's a couple extra die cuts for a little snowy base to it. I left those off until gluing my card together just so that I could put it right onto the base of the card. It was just the easiest way to do it there. So this here is where we're at right now. I want to add just a touch more texture, so I'm adding some glossy accents to the star on the top of the tree, and then some of that star dust stickles to the snow on the tree. So the snow trimming the tree as well as on the base. If you wanted even more sparkle to it, you could add that stardust stickles to the Merry Christmas sentiment as well. But I am of the opinion that less is more. So we got a lot of different textures here between just the regular cardstock, the swift dry ink, the metallic ink, and the glossy accents and the stickles. So it just adds a lot of dimension and interest when you're tilting them into the light. I let that completely dry so that we don't have to worry about possibly damaging the stickles and glossy accents. And you can see that we've got 3 different cards here, all created with 100% white cardstock. We didn't have a colored piece of cardstock in the mix, but because of those gorgeous inks, we have some really stunning cards with different finishes and textures to them because of the way those inks work. And by blending the different colors in together, we have more colors than just those ink colors there. And I just love the look of the Alchemist set here all together. It's a really unique color combination for Christmas. And again, they can be blended with others or combined with other ink colors as well. But just on their own, they create a really unique holiday color palette. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.